Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another episode or Zoom performance by the Burkle Center. We're very happy to have all of you with us today to hear from Ben Rhodes, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. So just a reminder about our format for this morning. I will briefly introduce Ben. Ben will come on and talk about his new book, and then he and I will have a conversation about it. And then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So please send in your questions using, I think it's the Q&A feature. We'll send an announcement around about that. And I'm happy to pose those to Ben, and we'll wrap in about an hour. So let me introduce our speaker and guest for today. So first of all, many of you know Ben as co-host of Pod Save the World, which he's done for several years now. Of course, former advisor to President Obama for the entire 8 years of the Obama administration. And since getting out of Washington, Ben has written a couple of books now. The first book, The World as It Is, was really a kind of straightforward memoir of time in office. And the second one, the one we're going to talk about today, After the Fall, which I have right here, and of course, highly recommend, a very interesting take, you'll hear about it in a moment, has just been released. I'll also add Ben is a former professor at UCLA, so he taught a course for us. In fact, he talks about it in the book a bit. And Ben doesn't know this, but I'm hoping to drag him back into that at some point in the future. So let me turn it over to Ben Rhodes, and we'll get into his book discussion. Ben, welcome.
Great. Someone has to let me start video. Okay. So there we go. Great, there I am. Okay. Thanks so much, Cal. It's good to be with you. And I would love to come back to UCLA. The parking aside, I had a wonderful experience. Look, I'll start by just kind of walking people through, I think, what I was trying to do with this book and how it kind of got written, because I think that then sets up what we'll talk about in the Q&A. But essentially for me, I left government after 8 years, from the time I was 31 to 39, and I'm kind of spit out on the back end of this experience, and really a decade if you count the 2 years of the Obama campaign. Incredibly disoriented. I think anyone who goes through 10 years in that kind of circumstance, there's a natural disorientation to leaving the room where things happen, and from that degree of stress and adrenaline. But then when you compound that with the fact that, Donald Trump is president of the United States, and he's dismantling on a kind of daily basis the things that you worked on, and he kind of represents the opposite of everything that you cared about. And as someone who worked on global issues, as I looked around the world, that was the dynamic that I saw happening in more and more places, if not kind of seemingly everywhere. I wanted to figure out a way to think about that and to process it myself, and ultimately to write about it. And I think the starting point for me is I started to travel a lot. And this book is really about, looking at the United States from the outside in, a bit like being in a dysfunctional family where you have to step outside to understand what's happening. Not that I've ever had that experience, but there are a couple of interactions that kind of planted the seed that became this book. The first one is in 2017, I was traveling actually with former President Obama in Germany. And I was in a place called Baden-Baden, Germany, which feels like the kind of place that an exile goes to, which is kind of very much how I describe my feeling as being an American in the Trump years. And I met a young woman named Jana Nemtsova, who'd driven over to see me. She herself was exiled, essentially. She was the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, who'd been assassinated in the shadow of the Kremlin. Nemtsov had been kind of a leading oppositionist to Vladimir Putin for years, and had been killed. And she had left Russia in part because she was trying to pursue support for a true investigation into the killing of her father. She wanted my help. She wanted Obama's help. And I had a very disorienting experience. And this is only like a couple of months after we'd left office, and realizing that I couldn't really help her. I mean, I didn't have the same, capacity, obviously, that I did in government to do much to help her. And but her story was incredibly compelling, and she was incredibly compelling, not just her dad. And I realized, well, how interesting it is to be able to inhabit what's happening in the world through this one person's story that she's telling me of everything that happened in her family's life, and to kind of wrestle with it as someone who has worked on those very same issues from a position of political power and now is looking at them from the outside. And then, a little bit later, I was meeting with a democracy activist from Hungary. And Hungary is a country that is essentially gone from being liberal democracy to being something of a single party autocracy. And I asked him, can you walk me through how that happened under Viktor Orban, your prime minister, who was elected in 2010? And he said, well, it's quite simple. Viktor Orban was elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis. He redrew the parliamentary districts to consolidate control for his party. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote. He packed the courts with right-wing judges who would find in favor of his power grabs. He demonized civil society, passed some restrictive laws there. He enriched a set of cronies who then financed Orban's politics, but also bought up pieces of the media and basically created a massive right-wing propaganda machinery. And they wrapped this whole thing up in a nationalism message, an us versus them message, where the us is the true Hungarians and the them are Muslims and immigrants and refugees and liberal elites and George Soros. And of course, he's describing this to me and I'm thinking, well, this sounds a bit like my lived experience for the last decade. And so then I realized that the idea for this book was essentially that I was going to try to understand the nationalist and authoritarian trend that was taking hold around the world, both as a means of understanding, hey, what's happening globally, but also as a means of understanding what's happening in America. And I ended up kind of choosing 4 countries that and I unfortunately could have chosen more, but 4 countries where I was going to find characters to tell this story: Hungary, Russia, China, and America. And each of those in their own way presents a different kind of flavor of this trend, but they're all connected. And in many ways, America is kind of symbiotic with all of them. And I'll just kind of briefly give people a sense of what I found in each place. I mean, I think Hungary was a fascinating place for me because it's kind of as a small to medium-sized country, it's been kind of a laboratory for the reemergence of this brand of really blood and soil ethno-nationalism that is more reminiscent of kind of pre-World War I times. And I met with a young woman who started help with her friends a new political party that's challenging Orban. This incredible anti-corruption activist Sándor Lederer, who's the one that I referred to earlier, an investigative journalist, a civil society activist. So I had kind of the cross section of people, mainly younger people, my age and younger at least, and how is their lived experience told the story of what's happened in Hungary and what people are doing to push back. And what I was really struck by is the extent to which, the financial crisis in 2008 had been this kind of cataclysmic event. Orban himself described it as on par with the 3 great global regime changes of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, and the end of the Cold War. Although he said, everybody knew in the 20th century when they woke up that the world had changed the day after those things ended. Not everybody understood that with the financial crisis, but he did, and people like him did. And the story that I heard from my Hungarian characters was basically one of democracy not living up to the promise that people had after the end of the Cold War. A sense of kind of mounting frustrations with the inequality generated by liberal democracy and the corruption that crept into Hungarian politics. And when the bottom fell out in 2008, Orban recognized that confidence in democracy itself had collapsed, particularly confidence in the kind of American-led globalization as a system that was kind of fundamentally unfair, in the same way that the last system was fundamentally unfair. There may have been more freedoms, but there was still this kind of rampant inequality and sense of dislocation. And there was this kind of unresolved history that bubbled underneath the surface of Hungarian political life, kind of like underground rivers, the unresolved history of the battles between communism and Nazism in Hungarian society, where some people had collaborated with either side of that. And he kind of grabbed hold of Hungarian politics, seizing on those grievances and that kind of backlash to the collapse of confidence in this model, and he was kind of pulling it back to this very familiar ethno-nationalism, which again, as my interlocutors reminded me repeatedly, like is more the norm than the exception. I mean, Hungary had only been a democracy for around under 20 years before Orban was elected, but also just throughout history. There's something unique about the post-World War II period where there's this progression towards democracy. And as one of the people I talked to, actually a British counterpart in this, told me, there's something of an elongated reason cycle that we were shocked by World War II and by the Holocaust into putting up some guardrails and tempering that ethno-nationalism and having debates about ideologies, but less about the kinds of things that got us into World War II. And as that historical memory had faded, this has now reemerged. And I think the Orban story is emblematic of what we see in the politics of a lot of countries, a lot of democracies in particular, that are drifting in a more nationalist direction. Then Russia was the very logical next step, because Orban had in many ways just copied the playbook that Putin himself had generated. And I had spent a lot of time, obviously, thinking about Vladimir Putin over the years. But for me, it was instructive to really go back to the point of origins. And I talked to Alexei Navalny. I talked to Zhana Nemtsova, who I mentioned, and a couple of other Russians. And, Navalny's story was incredibly instructive to me because, he described, kind of that sense of grievance and humiliation born out of the way that the Cold War ended. He described being a child, and he's taught to believe that Russia is the greatest country in the world, or the Soviet Union is, and then all of a sudden it collapses, and he's getting West German army rations as a child. And hearing him just recount that, you can kind of feel the kind of grievances that a Putin was able to tap into after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then his own career, and Boris Nemtsov's, has its roots in kind of the 1990s, when you had this kind of massive sell-off of the Russian state enterprises in incredibly corrupt ways. Everything that the Soviet state once controlled is just kind of being sold off bottom dollar to people who are becoming billionaires, while everybody else is kind of getting screwed. And that kind of compounds this sense of rage and disorder. And Putin simultaneously steps into that, and he simultaneously capitalizes on the grievances while enriching himself and his cronies by manipulating this. And Navalny's own story kind of traces this arc, because he starts out as kind of an anti-corruption activist in one of the liberal parties in Moscow on something simple. He's seeing neighborhoods getting destroyed by major real estate developments that are not compensating people who've been kicked out of their homes. And he's challenging these in courts, and he's losing because he's realizing that the whole system has been rigged and it's all corrupt. And he goes kind of independent, becomes an anti-corruption activist standing up to Putin. He's incredibly innovative. He buys shares, just a few shares of different Russian national oil companies, so he can sue them and get access to their books. And he kind of parallels, Putin's increasing repression. And then what I described is essentially how, after Putin had consolidated his power in Russia, he kind of sets out on a counter-revolutionary movement against America and the liberal order. And that's when you get an increasingly assertive and aggressive Russian foreign policy that's aimed at undermining democracy itself, not just in Russia, but in everywhere. And he finds obviously these perfect tools in American-made social media platforms that give him entry into the lives of every one of us, right? And so this machinery that he's built in Russia to kind of control what people are consuming and thinking, goes on offense, along with the kind of repression of people like Navalny and others. But also great innovation from people like Navalny and the Russians who are standing up to this. And we can get more into kind of some of the lessons that may be taken from that. And then I went to China, and I really immersed myself principally in the Hong Kong protest movement, but also talked to people from China, mainland China itself. Although even though I traveled to China, those conversations tend to take place outside of China. And where China is actually where I see the future, in the sense of, I described the experience of being in Shanghai and being woken up in my hotel room and visited by some Chinese officials in 2017 who wanted to warn me that Barack Obama should not meet with the Dalai Lama. And what was so disconcerting about that is in part that we hadn't announced a meeting with the Dalai Lama. This was not a public thing. And so the implicit point was that somebody's communications were being monitored. And I remember walking out and looking at the Shanghai skyline, which looks like the future. It's beautiful, kind of futuristic skyline, lights glistening off the water. There's people taking selfies everywhere. And I remember thinking to myself that, this is quite logical, that if you take kind of America's 30 years of global supremacy and hegemony, and you take the capitalism and the national security focus and the technological mania, and you just strip out democracy, you would get exactly what I was looking at, and that kind of planted the seed of like, well, I want to think about how has America been a part of these trends and how we wittingly or unwittingly also contributed to them. And the Hong Kong movement was a fascinating window into how young people in particular are figuring out what their identities are as there's this encroaching future in which technology facilitates a much more totalitarian control over what you can say and do and ultimately what you think. And then I end, the longest section of the book is about America itself. And I'm the character, and Obama comes in and out, and a couple of others. And where I really land here as we go, I had the unique experience of finishing this during the pandemic and BLM and the election, is that, the most important thing we can do for ourselves in the world is not a foreign policy or domestic policy, although there are things we need to do. It's we have to figure out what it means to be American. What is our democratic identity that we seem to have lost and seems to be so contested today. So I'll stop there, Cal. I went on for a bit. Sorry about that, but wanted to set up everything and happy to talk about any piece of it.
Great. That was fantastic, Ben. And I'm just going to hold the book up again so everyone can see it. Maybe you can't actually see it with this crazy backdrop, but there's a link circulating around, and the book actually has on the cover a scene from Hong Kong and kind of umbrellas everywhere, and kind of evoking a lot of things you just talked about.
Yeah.
So, there's so many interesting things about the book, and it's so I've read your previous one, which is, also a terrific deep dive into what it's like to be in the White House, but in many ways a much more straightforward memoir. This one is sort of a combination, as you kind of suggested, of a memoir, a kind of travelogue, but also a lot of interesting thinking about what is the world that we're in today and how did we get here, and to some degree where we're going, but more how did we get here? And with that in mind, you mentioned 2008. And that really does jump out a lot in the book as a really pivotal turning point in history. I think one of your characters at one point, one of your interviewees calls it like a hinge point, or uses a phrase like that I think really captures something that, for I think virtually everyone listening, watching right now, we remember it, but it's interesting to go back, something that isn't actually all that far away. I don't remember feeling like it was a hinge point, but it was. So maybe say a little more about sort of how you came to understand that in writing the book.
I was really struck by that, Cal. And look, I knew it was a huge event at the time. It obviously consumed the early part of the Obama presidency, but I think it was a bigger deal than we even saw. I think the place I'd start this is that when I was in Hong Kong, I actually talked to a Hong Kong government official anonymously. And, I said to him, I'm working on this book about the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism. And what do you begin, and he said, well, it goes back to 2008. That's when in the West, people lost confidence in liberal democracy, and that opened the door to the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism. And that's when here in China, the government looked around and said, wait a second, we don't necessarily have to wait and defer to these guys anymore. Maybe there's a model, we can challenge them with our model instead of just kind of developing in parallel. And that kind of summed up in miniature, kind of one of the core arguments of the whole book, which is that that's what happened. Now, it's obviously a more complicated story, but I do think that, in the West, and in kind of, the democratic world, if you will, that event was a big deal, in the sense that America had already kind of been, the Iraq War had already kind of delivered a bit of a body blow to kind of confidence in that the Americans kind of knew what they were doing and were trusted stewards of this. But the main thing that we had done, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the three countries I look at are all on the other side of the Berlin Wall, is just kind of unleash this flood of globalization, which really was capitalism. And in some places it was democracy too. And that seemed to have this extraordinary momentum, like that everything was kind of solved and people were going to get woven together in this system that inevitably was going to make places freer. And when the bottom fell out of that, it was like, well, maybe this isn't the best option. Maybe we should start shopping for other ones. And I think that's what that Hong Kong official was telling me. And that's definitely the feeling you got. I mean, if you look at even the Brexit slogan, Cal, and I look at the UK a little bit in this book, was take back control. I think there was a sense that everywhere that, people had lost control and their traditional identities, usually their ethno-nationalist identities, kind of became the port in the storm after that financial crisis, which, by the way, most of the rest of the world felt much more acutely than Americans. As bad as it was here, it was much, much worse in places like Hungary. And I do think there's something in China to this idea that they were always kind of growing and growing and growing, but they were kind of on certain core things, it's like we defer to the Americans. And as one person described to me, the moment when Alan Greenspan testified after the collapse of the economy, he's asked what went wrong, and he said there was a flaw in our thinking. And the flaw was assuming that firms would essentially, have like a self-interest in their shareholders' interest. And he was like, bam, that was the moment, that was the gunshot heard in Asia, like there's a flaw, and so the Greenspan was kind of this oracle and, kind of emblematic of this whole system. If he doesn't know why this happened, well, maybe the Beijing consensus is the better bet.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was kind of mulling, it was the problem that capitalism of the sort that drove us to 2008 was it capitalism itself, was it kind of inherent, or was it kind of a bad form of capitalism? So on the one hand, 2008 seems like, yeah, Greenspan, I'm sure, is right, and we had flaws in our system. But on the other hand, you talk a lot about the kind of crony capitalism that arose in places like Hungary and Russia in particular. And you kind of point out that Russia was really the template. And there it seemed like maybe the problem was not that we had too many markets or too much market, but that the markets were just totally rigged. And here they were kind of rigged too, but not nearly in the way that they were in Russia. So anyway, I don't know there's really an answer to that
it's a critical question, because I do think that in places like Hungary and Russia, and I would argue to some extent here, corruption itself and this kind of crony capitalism and oligarchic capitalism has really been the driving force behind the authoritarianism. I mean, Putin basically runs a racket, and so does Orban to some extent. I mean, Orban's childhood friend who went from being a pipe fitter to a billionaire,
Yeah. Disturbing.
But I think these things are connected, Cal, in the sense that I'm all for capitalism, to some extent. But it was the kind of unregulated, the Americanized kind of unregulated form of capitalism that kind of washed over things had these blind spots, and in America, the blind spots were, financial schemes and kind of policies that just exploded inequality. As that kind of hit places like Hungary and Russia, the blind spots became, there's a tolerance for this kind of corruption. I mean, go to, Davos, right? Like, I haven't been, but I mean, I'm pretty safe bet if you went there, there are a lot of oligarchs, private jets, and they're on panel discussions with, the great titans of industry and politics in America. Like this whole system kind of knew what was happening and was kind of like, well, but it's all to the good. And Navalny told me that, the 2008 crisis, he's like, look, that played back to Putin's argument, because Putin, at the end of the day, doesn't push back that hard against the idea that there's some corruption. But his argument is it's corrupt everywhere. The Americans just have a different version of corruption. And when the banks are getting bailed out and everybody else is kind of getting screwed in the US, that's like his argument. It's like, see, like, they may have democracy, but it's the same thing in the end with, and I think it's, again, I don't want to assign all the agency to us, but I do think the excesses of our kind of post-Reagan Cold War model, in a lot of ways, this book, where I'm critical of the US and self-critical in ways, even about some Obama policies, it's the excesses that came from being so powerful, that power corrupts, right? And I think this is one of those areas where, even though we were not constructing these oligarchic schemes, and we like tolerated the blind spot, and we encouraged those Russian sell-offs, that created this. We thought, well, just privatize everything and it'll work out, and it didn't.
Yeah. The other thing that jumped out at me, I mean, there are many themes kind of running through the book, but 2008 was one of the big things that kind of really jumped out. The other one was, you have this phrase, which I forget if you got from one of your interlocutors or not, which isn't maybe unique to you, but really was a running kind of theme in the book. The notion that the 20th century was a century of ideology, 21st century appears to be a century of identity. And obviously those are not distinct eras.
Yeah.
You can see the overlap, maybe even in the 90s in a lot of ways, or maybe even earlier. But there was a way in which, when we look back, it's amazing actually how much people cared about ideology in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and didn't really think in identity terms the way that they do today all over the world. So anyway, that was something that really jumped out. And I'm just curious about how you see that unfolding going forward. And what do you think the cause of that is?
So this, Bao Pu, who's one of the lead characters, fascinating guy. I mean, I hope, people find his voice as compelling as I did. Bao Pu's, was in Tiananmen. His father was a senior Communist Party official, but in the reform camp. He sees people shot all around him. His father gets basically imprisoned, or at least put under house arrest. And Bao Pu leaves China, comes to the US for a while, then goes to Hong Kong, where he sets up a publishing house that publishes a lot of kind of things that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like, right? They would never be published on the mainland.
And just to be clear, his father was pretty high ranking.
Yes. His father was high ranking. His father was kind of the advisor to was an advisor to the general secretary. So this was someone in the middle of things, who wanted to negotiate with the students. And Bao Pu made this case to me that basically that the Chinese Communist Party after Tiananmen understood that they needed new sources of legitimacy, that they're looking around the world and they're like, communism isn't going to be it anymore. And what they kind of settled on is, okay, part of the legitimacy is going to be, we're going to open up the economy, and just results is going to be legitimacy, people getting lifted out of poverty. And I want to be clear, like, some extraordinary things have happened, including hundreds of millions of Chinese people being lifted out of poverty. But also, they turned very aggressively to Chinese nationalism. And they'd once discarded under Mao, say, Confucius, and suddenly they are embracing Confucius and Confucian values. And and that the textbooks and the education system and the media is becoming much, much more nationalist. I mean, remember, communism was global, right? And suddenly this is kind of a steady rebranding of the Chinese Communist Party as kind of this blend of state-controlled capitalism and Chinese nationalism, and essentially making them themselves inseparable from Chinese identity. And so it was Bao Pu who made this point to me more broadly, that the 20th century was about ideology, fascism, communism, capitalism, democracy. And Hungary lived right on the fault lines of that. And Russia obviously was a participant in that. But that the 21st century is about identity. It's about, the older questions of who we are that tend in the direction of nationalism, and particularly ethno-nationalism. And I think that's right, and because if you look around, from here, with the internal difficulties we're having in this country, to Brexit, to what's happening in Hungary, to Hindu nationalism in India, to what Erdogan's done in Turkey, to obviously Putin, and I mean, this is what's happening everywhere, a version of this, and I think that's very bad, because this kind of where does that lead? I mean, it only leads to kind of conflict. That's why we moved away from nationalism after World War II. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think people need identities. People need to feel centered, and inevitably, a reaction to globalization was going to be people being like, "Wait a second, like." I get why people don't want to just live in a world in which they don't feel like they belong to a smaller community, But one of the things I heard from the younger people, say the young Hungarians, and to some extent the Hong Kongers, although in a different way, is that, well, you can have different identities. Hong Kongers are like, our identity is our city, it's not a nationality. Our city kind of but then our city stands for some values. And in Hungary, what I heard is a guy saying like, look, the answer here is, well, the political party that I look at, Momentum, that was founded by these young people, their whole point is like, I think I can be Hungarian and European. I don't think those things are in conflict. I think those things are very complementary. And so younger people are kind of figuring out ways to have multiple identities. And that, I think, is our only hope, because if we are defining ourselves only by our different identities, only by our differences, that's never led anywhere but to bad things in history.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's interesting to think about. I don't know if you went back and looked at, Sam Huntington, the late Harvard professor, wrote these two essays in the 90s, one, Clash of Civilizations, that got a lot of attention. And then the other one was something like who we are, who America is. I can't remember what the title was, but it's essentially also, he was lambasted for both of them in a way that was probably, I think justified to some degree, but he was pretty prescient about the way that these identity, even if the details aren't necessarily correct, that identity would be the key feature going forward, and that we here in the United States would also face this struggle over who are we as a nation. And you actually spent a fair bit of time in the book trying to unpack that. What does it mean? Trump has an answer to that. The Republican Party today has an answer. It's a white nation. It's a Christian nation. It's a nation that definitely is not Barack Obama, for sure. And where I think most of us, I'm imagining on this call, certainly me and you, Ben, have a different view of what America is, and think that, it's fantastic that America is this place that people are drawn to from all over the world, and that's one of our strengths, that we're actually a diverse nation. But that's a true struggle. And in any event, he saw some of those things early on. And I think you're right, the issue of coming to a sense of identity that isn't necessarily exclusionary or hostile to others is going to be the key feature. And to some degree, I don't think you talk about this in the book, but I was struck thinking about how, the 50 states all have identities in a sense. You and I both grew up in, New York State and live in California, and we kind of have identities as New Yorkers, or people have identities as different, but we still think of ourselves as Americans. And there is a way in which you can have multiple identities, and many Europeans absolutely do. So I think you're right about that.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing on that. I totally agree. And I do mention in the book, how I thought of myself as a New Yorker, as an American, as someone from a Jewish background, even though I was religiously Jewish. I mean, I think, what should be so great about America is we're supposed to be the country that solved this problem, that you can be from anywhere and believe anything and be American. And what I think America is a place made up of people from everywhere, where a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy allows us to try to get better, tries to live up to this kind of story we tell ourselves. And in a way, Trump and Obama are perfect, opposites. Trump, the exclusive identity that's largely white and Christian and backward looking. Obama, the inclusive future, the idea that America, in his own person, he blended together these different identities. And I think that, throughout our history, right? Like we had a Declaration of Independence where it said all men are created equal, written by a guy with slaves. Like this has been, it's not a new competition, but it plays out in new ways. And it's particularly intense now. And look, part of the truth, and I wrestle with this in the book, is like, Obama, I remember saying to him an argument that I make in the book, which is like, well, in the Cold War, it did seem like at least everybody agreed upon certain basic things. We were for these things and the Soviets were for these other things. And there were kind of guardrails against someone like Trump becoming president. And as Obama pointed out to me, well, yeah, but all the people in the rooms were white men. So it's easier to agree on all these things. And so part of the challenge here, and I talk about in the book, is like the particularly American flavor of this is, yes, some of the 2008 backlash that led to like the Tea Party was the sense of grievance because the system appeared rigged, but some of it was that we had Black president, and that increasingly, we're an increasingly diverse society, and there's been a reaction to that. And that's what makes these stakes so much higher here, is that we're either going to kind of work through that and emerge on the other side as a truly diverse and inclusive nation, or we're not. And that either way is going to be incredibly disruptive to some people.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Do you see let me just ask you a little bit, you brought up China in a few different ways, and obviously it plays a large role in the book. The US-Chinese relationship is so complex, and you had a kind of bird's eye view for many years. But now that you've done this kind of research for this book and thought a little more about where we stand in 2021, where do you see that relationship going? Because the two nations are on very different political tracks, even though you show some tangencies. One of the things that's striking about China that you point out, as others have, is the way that technology is being used in nefarious ways. But of course, that's also true here. It's maybe not the government that does as much of it, it's the private sector. But either way, technology is kind of rapidly kind of controlling us. And that's one of the points you make in the book, that there's this kind of, I think you use the phrase techno-totalitarianism.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, I think, pretty accurate. So I'm curious where you see US-China relations going in the near term, given the kind of disparate paths we're on right now, even with these commonalities.
I mean, quickly, I was, pretty terrified inhabiting the technology, where the technology is going. And as you say, it happens, Amazon knows things about me that, the Hong Kongers, the story they told me was one of, and this was their words, not me, repeatedly they cited George Orwell. And they're like, it got to a certain point where this is Hong Kong too, where there's not total control. And I look at, the Uyghur situation and where there is total control too, but they're like, this society starts to be controlled because it just kind of becomes clear, like, if you want to get ahead, if you want to get a job, you want to advance in life, you don't be critical of the Chinese Communist Party online. You don't even go to websites that might be critical because someone's going to be monitoring that. You don't even send emails because someone could be reading that. And if there's such an effort to control what you can say and what information you can access, and invariably that's controlling what you think, so it's not just controlling speech. Technology allows you to go to the next level and to kind of literally engineer how people think, because there's so many incentives to think a certain way and so many disincentives. And what I call out in the book, and Cal, you and I have talked about this, and I think you've written about it, is like, we are already doing that here. I mean, I tell the story of Daryl Morey, tweeting about Hong Kong protesters and the NBA, losing, all this money. But like, I also tell the story about like Hollywood. Like, when's the last time you saw a movie that was at all critical of the Chinese government? John Cena just had to apologize in Mandarin because the Fast franchise relies on that market. Our culture, which is supposed to be the freest in the world, has already self-censored itself. You don't even see that many movies about democracy like you used to, because a movie about democracy, even if it's not critical of China, is not going to run in China, which is as big a market, if for bigger for some movies than here. That's already happening. I'm uncomfortable with that, but maybe that's what people want. And my basic point, and this gets to your point of where this is going, is Americans have to decide, do we care about that? If we do, it requires completely changing our China policy, because if you look at it from the outside in, even from China's perspective, what has America cared more about these last 30 years, including when I was there? When I know in the first term we needed China's help to save the global economy. After that financial crisis, in the second term, we needed to work with them in Paris to get the Paris Agreement done. Every president has had something that they wanted to work with China on since Tiananmen. That was important, but the message then is we care more about profits and national security and the development of technology than we care about democracy. How could you conclude anything else from looking at US-China policy for the last 30 years? And if we've gone to the mat with the Chinese over like their purchases of soybeans more than their human rights record.
And I think partly we believed it was going to happen inevitably. It was going to be the internet, or it was going to be wealth, or we didn't need to worry. I mean, this is, I'm sure, a justification maybe post hoc.
Yeah.
We didn't need to worry because China was going to turn into us sooner or later. Turns out,
yes,
maybe not.
We thought that, and whether we thought that because it was a rationalization. I mean, I think I remember genuinely thinking that for a time. I didn't think it evolved into a rationalization. And when Xi Jinping took power, it's like you can't avoid it anymore. So to me, we have to figure out, and the Biden team is kind of in the process of doing this, like, okay, if we actually really care about democracy, we're going to have to kind of go to the mat with these guys on things, in ways that are uncomfortable, but in ways that I don't think need to lead to like a war or even a Cold War. It just means, readjusting our priorities in the world.
Yeah, agreed. So I know some of the questions we'll touch on this. So let me go to questions from viewers about our discussion. There's quite a few. So let me start with one actually about people are going to ask about the Biden administration, of course.
Yeah, that's fine.
I know that's fine with you. So the first question, Biden administration recently approved military aid to Egypt, with Tony Blinken stating that there'd been progress in terms of human rights. Given President Biden's campaign, given that he campaigned on, quote, no more blank checks for Trump's favorite dictator and human rights, how can human rights be recalibrated in this administration? So I think feel free to answer that more broadly outside of Egypt, but what should President Biden be doing?
So I'll answer this I tell this story, and I'll do it quickly, in the book of Mohammed Sultan, who, because I talk about how I think the forever war mindset has contributed to this anti-democratic trend. Mohammed was an Egyptian American from Ohio who went back to Egypt around Tahrir Square. He sees Mubarak get toppled. He's hopeful. He stays there. Then he's shot in 2013 after the Morsi coup, the coup that removed Mohammed Morsi. He's thrown in prison, even though he's an American citizen. He's tortured in just brutal ways. They let people die in his cell. They encourage him to commit suicide. He goes on a hunger strike. Then they let an ISIS recruiter into his cell. And he debates the ISIS recruiter about the merits of nonviolent resistance versus violent resistance. This is a government, the Egyptian government, that we've given billions of dollars to, that is putting ISIS recruiters in the cells because they want to radicalize their opposition, because that justifies their repression and keeps the billions of dollars coming. I didn't like it when we did it in the Obama administration. I wouldn't give them a cent. Like, how can we talk to anybody in the world about democracy and be shoveling billions of dollars to defense contractors who then send the weapons to the Egyptians? I mean, it's the height of hypocrisy. I mean, and look, I get you can't have perfect, the world is what it is, and it's a tough place, and you have no government can be a pure expression of values. But I think the degree, when you look at someone like a Mohammed bin Salman or a Sisi in Egypt, the degree of repression that we are tacitly in case of MBS or directly in the case of Egypt subsidizing, yeah, it totally discredits anything we have to say about democracy, and it kind of corrupts ourselves. And so I know I have the luxury of being outside of government. I can assure you I made these arguments when I was in government and lost. Um, I think that the bar has to get higher in terms of our pursuit of consistency, which we'll never be able to achieve perfectly, right? I mean, we're not perfect, we never will be, right? But I would like to see this taken more seriously by the Biden team, and I'd say that, like I said that in the book about, I would have liked that Barack Obama took it more seriously.
I mean, I think if I remember right, you point out in the book that with regard to China, there was a moment where President Obama was seeking Chinese assistance with, I think, the Paris Accord and climate change, and could have, am I getting this right? Could have been, right? You wanted him to be more critical about human rights, but he made the calculation, and you I think tacitly kind of supported it at the time.
Yeah.
Of, hey, climate change is an existential threat. Point being that there's always going to be a or equally big fish to fry, and politicians inevitably have to make these choices. Somehow human rights ends up getting the short end of the stick all the time.
I think, and I'd say quickly on that, Cal, it's like, again, it's not going to be perfect, and you're going to have to deal with the Chinese government. And I actually think sometimes engagement can be a better way of trying to pursue human rights. Obviously, I engage with the Cuban government. I think in the Middle East, though, it's gotten, because the ends that we're seeking, right, counterterrorism and peace, are not being facilitated by this military aid. So that one, I think, is actually weirdly an easier. And people may say to me, well, if we back out, then the Russians will come in. Well, how could it be, more repressive than it already is? And there's a cost to just supporting repression, to our own, to ourselves, and to what we represent in the world.
Yes. So the next question sort of dovetails a bit on that. So, I mean, this question is posed in terms of Trump, but it really can go beyond. So after Trump, can America still be considered a leader in the push for democracy? I mean, the system seems to be falling apart even now as the country becomes more polarized.
So the hopeful note I end on in this is look, I think Trump is we'd already had some body blows, and democracy itself kind of got attached to the Iraq War in ways that I think were very corrosive to our capacity to promote democracy around the world, which I support. Obviously, I'm rooting for democracy. If you read the book, you'll see my heart is with all of these movements and people. I think the opportunity for and the danger of Trump is obviously our democracy looked like it's coming apart, but people saw not just Donald Trump as president, they saw that we elected Donald Trump president, and they're wondering, who are these people?
There's a
lot of that, and I think there's an opportunity in that, though, which is that we're like everybody else. We have an exceptional story, but in terms of like the nation can be a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, but we can have a corrupt autocrat with a son-in-law down the hall, like everybody else has had in the world. And the opportunity is, if we can work through it, it's actually it's more relevant example to people around the world than if we're just sitting there on high, issuing demands. Like our actions, our capacity to fight through this, if we can, I think will be a very powerful and positive example to people in other countries. If we can't, well, then we've got bigger problems. But I found a huge amount of opportunity and even hope in being fallen, and the title is After the Fall, because then you're more recognizable. You're not just the big bad Americans up on the city on the hill of the war. You're down with everybody else trying to solve this problem. And if we can solve it, I think that really will ripple out.
Interesting. So next question, also related to democracy issues. Do you think a majority of young people, and the questioner defines that as under 25, are pro-democracy? Is it different in China, the US, Russia, the EU, Nigeria, et cetera? Can you say anything about patterns? But I guess generally, is democracy something that's still an ideal around the world?
I think so. I mean, I think I there are a lot of young people that I talk to for this book, and I engage a lot of young people through some other vehicles I have and work I do. And I've definitely found young people, broadly speaking, to be more inclusive, tolerant of different identities, of just differences. And I think that's a key starting point to democracy. It's just your willingness to live peacefully with other people and value them for who they are. I particularly think in Europe, for instance, young people are really, there's a backlash to the backlash. You know, if Orban and Brexit kind of was this backlash to democracy itself in a way, and globalization, a lot of young people are now kind of trying to swing the pendulum back. I think in this country, I've been struck in teaching at the extent to which young people, and I've taught at UCLA, I've taught at another school in the city who I won't name in the UCLA event. But the young people I've taught, and I interact with a lot because of Pod Save the World and traveling around, like are pretty pissed. And they're like, this democracy does not look like me at all. And, you know, I've been in a lot of rooms where like Bernie Sanders was like the right wing, you know, I think people don't have an idea that like people are moving left, young people in this country in a way that, you know, like Barack Obama is a controversial figure in conversations. And I think there's some help in that, because I think that the anger that, or in the kind of bewilderment at a government that doesn't deal with climate change and doesn't really deal with any of the issues that young people seem to care about, and that is stuck having these kind of petty debates in Washington, that's hopeful in a way. But if it tips into apathy and just tuning out, that's the danger. And because what I find everywhere, by the way, is that's exactly what the autocratic playbook is. Like young people are a threat to us because young people tend to be more progressive and tend to want things to change for the better. So I'm going to make politics look so revolting to them that they just tune it out and they go do other stuff. And that's worked quite well in a lot of places. And I think that's the playbook here, right? And so I think young people have to be mindful, like, no, the reason it looks so insane is that's what they want you to do. You actually have the power to change this. You're basically the only ones who do, because if you voted in certain numbers, different people win. And so I always implore young people to remember that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's funny, people talk about Orwell a lot, and you did, but in some ways, you know, Huxley, Brave New World, was more prescient. You know, he talks about this world in which people are just too busy entertaining themselves and drugged up, basically, in a way, and just tuned out. And that's actually technologically tuned out, facilitated by that. That's actually the real threat. And I thought that was really striking in your book, the way that so many autocrats really do take advantage of people's distaste for politics and, you know, inevitable inertia to just get their way eventually, to kind of wait things out. And I agree. I hope that that doesn't happen here. It doesn't seem to be. I mean, based on what I see around us, you know, UCLA and LA are both places with, you know, pretty active political culture right now. Hopefully it lasts.
It feels that way. But the risk, right, is like, let's say the Republicans rig all these election laws, win the midterms, and then basically kind of steal the election in 2024. I don't know what happens. I think we'll have nothing good. And not just because the Republicans won. I mean, there will be some kind of breakdown, I think, in social cohesion from the left this time. And, you know, I think also the Chinese figured, like the Chinese Communist Party, I always try to separate governments from people, because I don't think people are responsible for their governments, even in some democracies. You know, TikTok is interesting to me because the Chinese have tried to create this experiment where you get the culture of liberal democracy. You know, you get Beyonce and you get you know, big Marvel movies, and you get
the NBA.
You get the NBA, but we don't want any politics in that, no democracy in that. Can we kind of control this so that people have this thing to, you know, entertain them, you know, but they just don't have any ideas in it. And I'm not suggesting there's great ideas in the music and movies, but it's, you know, it's not overtly political. And TikTok is interesting because, I mean, here there's politics on TikTok, but I think, you know, it's not a coincidence that that's the social media platform that emerged from China, because it's kind of about just like it's less. I mean, Twitter is a political. It facilitates kind of debate and argument in ways that I think are even unhealthy, obviously, as much as I indulge in it. TikTok can become a space of just, you know, creativity without politics and entertainment without it. You know, I think there's something interesting about the fact that that's the social media platform that emerged from China.
Yeah, that's interesting. You might be right. It might be that TikTok is just so new. If you look at the early days of Facebook seemed pretty benign, pretty friendly,
Yeah,
uh, not very political, certainly, became very political over time.
yeah.
And, maybe it's that, maybe it's young people, it's hard to say, but yeah, that is an interesting point. Um,
TikTok got political in Gaza recently. I mean, it was
yeah, it
interesting to see
has,
people
it has,
using it. So it can be used in a very political way to just show what's happening someplace,
right.
which is probably not where the Chinese government would like to see it evolve.
I'm sure. Well, Ben, this has been great. And I really want to emphasize to everyone listening, watching, that Ben's book is a really thoughtful take on all the issues that we've talked about in the last hour, studded with some great stories. Ben is a really good writer. So I didn't really introduce him this way, but you probably know he wrote, many of the greatest speeches that President Obama gave. And that writing verve comes through in the book. So it's an enjoyable read. I highly recommend it. And of course, available anywhere, I'm sure Amazon, but many other places as well. So Ben, thanks again for coming on. Hope to have you back.
Thanks so much, Kyle. It was awesome. Great talking to you.
Take care, everyone.